Well, hello, and welcome back to the Patristica YouTube channel. Today, I'm joined by Mark Bilby and Markus Vincent, and today's video is going to take a slightly different format to many of the ones that we have made before, but more about that in just a second. Recently, Markus has been involved in quite an exciting collaboration with CJ Cornthwaite, and we thought it'd be a great idea just to point you in the direction of his channel, linked down in the description, and get Markus to tell you all about it so that you might be interested in clicking on it and learning about all the things that Markus has to teach us. So, Markus, why don't you just tell us how that interview came about, where it was, and what the viewers might expect?
I think it was a great opportunity to have a conversation with Christopher Cornthwaite in Bertinoro. Bertinoro is one of these fantastic places in the north of Italy, not far away from Bologna, just south of Bologna in the mountains, or rather the hills. And that was a place which was a seminary and the bishop's palace in previous years. But then, because no more seminarists are there, so the seminary was sold together with the palace, and the University of Bologna bought it as one of their conference centers. So that's where the conference takes place. And it is a conference that is annually and brings together New Testament colleagues from Italy, from around the world, discussing upcoming books and newer ideas, also older ideas. And this time, Christopher Cornthwaite was with us. He is a fantastic colleague, a freelance worker at the moment. He had done his PhD with John Kloppenberg, so a renowned scholar from Canada, and Christopher is himself based in Canada. So he came over to Bertinoro to conduct a few interviews, amongst which he invited me to contribute to his channel, because he's running a fantastic channel and also a podcast. You will find the links below in our channel here, because we agreed that we would cross-reference, because what he's doing is so close to what we do, but from a different perspective as always. And within that interview, he asked me about a few fundamental questions, because people of his channel, different from our channel here, are not too much used to those questions which we raise, in particularly the question that he asked me, namely, what about the New Testament? Is it just a compilation and the development of a compilation? And how do we understand the canonization process? And he wanted particularly to speak about the book which I published with Cambridge University Press on resetting the origins of Christianity. Now he showed me in the beginning a book which was bitten up and down, and he told me the story that he had the book in his car while his dog was chewing on my book, and I hoped that he didn't suffer too much from it, because we know, and that was the start, people suffer when they read this kind of a book, because it is in some way, it is not just resetting. For some people, it's upsetting. And to be also fair, as I said to Christoph in this interview, what we want to achieve as scholars is first to upset ourselves. It is always the attempt at working against our own assumptions. That's the fundamental assumption for scholarship. If you just want to assure, by reading whatever you read, by discussing whatever you discuss with people, to just reassure yourself, I think you're from the start off the road of any scholarship. And I was then looking into a few more of his work that he does with his channel, and I came across this one episode where he discusses almost the assault of one of our colleagues who wrote to him, disgracing him by stating that he, as a young man, he shouldn't make those claims on his channel as he does. Second, he wouldn't have the credentials as an academic, and. Now, to me, I think anybody in this world should raise any question that she or he has, irrespective of age. I tell you, becoming a bit older doesn't make you wiser. Sometimes it makes you more stupid. My grandma always said, when she married my grandpa, she thought, when he gets older, it gets easier. No, he became even more difficult. And that's what human beings are. Yeah, we are not becoming so much wiser. We are becoming more edgy and more eccentric and more problematic. So to this colleague, I'd like to say, please shut up. Otherwise, try to criticize yourself. With Christoph, I've learned so much. And this is what the channel should do. Question your assumptions and then get into a discussion. And if you get into a discussion, you will move away from some of the positions that you have held before. I have learned so much with Mark and Jack here on the channel. I've learned so much with so many questions you have asked. Please keep on asking, irrespective of age. And I tell you, Chris has a PhD from a very respected university. But even if you haven't got a PhD, if you haven't got a BA, ask the questions which come into your mind. The questions often are the key and the trigger. And I look through the reports. I look through everything I can read as a response I sometimes give. If I have something to say, if I don't have something to say, I just read it. But the questions you are asking on all these channels are being recognized. Hence, today we do the question and answer session, and I don't want to carry on for too much. So, on this episode, one of the key things which he then put also into the description was the discovery for him that the New Testament is a multiply rewritten combination of texts. And what I try to say is when you put texts together in history, it is rarely done just by adding texts. So the canonization process, which by necessity is a conglomerating of texts. So you have not just one gospel in our New Testament canon, we have 4 gospels. We have not just 4 gospels, we have 4 gospels plus Acts. We don't have just Acts, we have Acts plus the Catholic letters, followed by Paul's letters, and at the end, even followed by Revelation. Whoever and however these books have come together, the moment you put pieces together, they form a different pictures and a different picture from the individual pieces that these pieces were before they have been added with other pieces. So that's the first fact. This is the first, most simple rewriting. Second comes, which I also mentioned in this issue, is the order. It makes such a difference what comes first, what comes in the middle, what comes last. We can see that here. The first thing today was Jack's question. A question, so the opening of any kind of thing we do sets the tone and sets the answer, at least part of the answer. So when we have the 4 Gospels in the opening of our canonical New Testament, this is a big statement. And we should not just look at individual texts or as a collection per se, but in the order in which those texts are being put together. I give you the opposite example. As we know, we have only 2 New Testaments in the 2nd century. One that is called New Testament, the other which is called collection. Hasn't got a name. The one which hasn't got a name in the 2nd century is our canonical New Testament. It has received this title only in the 3rd century. If you prove me wrong, please let me know. I can tell you, I've checked everything. That's what the facts are. People sometimes criticize Wolfram Kinsey, who has made that claim before and has shown that Marcion was the first who has been credited with bringing and coming up with this title. People have then said, well, but surely our canonical New Testament must also have been called New Testament in the 2nd century. That's a claim without substantiation. Now, those two New Testament collections we have from the 2nd century have different openings. There's one opening, the Marcionite New Testament, which carries this name, opens with Marcion's name, with Marcion's text, because it starts with Marcion's preface. All our testimonies tell us that. And we also know the title of this preface. It's called the Antitheses, or as we would translate them, the opposites. And then in his commentary, because the commentary starts with the preface in Tertullian Book 4, Tertullian gives us some insights, what was part of that preface. He doesn't give everything, but he gives us a few hints and insights. And he shows that next to details, the most important thing for Marcion in his preface was to say, new is the opposite to old. Now, opposite doesn't mean that old is not necessary. For something to be new, he was aware of that, you need old. And that's why he calls, also potentially for the first time, the Jewish Bible the Old Testament. So right from the start, in this New Testament, and now you understand why in the 2nd century nobody called the canonical collection New Testament, because it was too much Marcionite. New was understood as the opposite of the Jewish tradition of the Old Testament. That was the opening of the preface. And it comes that then Marcion must have drawn in this preface examples from the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, and set them in opposition to what he gathered and redacted potentially in his New Testament. For example, when he says, well, the Old Testament says eye for an eye, ear for an ear, and so forth. However, Jesus says you should hold your cheek if you're a, and so forth. You see the opposites. And that seems to have been very much the content of this apparently longer preface. And then at the end, Tertullian gives us also a report, potentially even a quote from the end of the preface. And in the end of the preface, he says, well, we have the opposition of this one God, the transcendent God, and the Jewish God, the creator God. Then we have the opposition of the Jewish God's Messiah, who is promised to come to restate the status of Israel. But we have the Messiah of the transcendent God, and he has come to have a salvific function for every human being, not just for Israel, but also not excluding Israel, for everybody. And the end opposition, the last opposition that he mentions, is the opposition between Christianity, Christianismos, he says, and Judaism. And for the first time in history, if Daniel Boiano is right, and I think he is, we find that this opposition, which puts Christianity as a substance, as a noun, in opposition to another entity, which is Judaism, here in this preface. And again, it is not by saying we have these opposites that they are battling or fighting against each other. On the contrary, in Marcion's Gospel, it becomes quite clear later on that opposition means you hang together. You want to be different, but you hang together. And if you lose the one, you lose the other. He gives this fantastic example of the new wine and you need new wineskins. So then the message of this Christ, of the transcendent God, the New Testament and the new wine, you can only fill in the new form, and that is the New Testament. If you put that into the Ketuvim, into the writings of the old Jewish tradition, he says, the wine, the new wine, will make the wineskins burst, and everything gets lost, which means the new message gets lost, but you see, the wineskins get also lost. So you can't put new wine in old wineskins. They break. Hence, this kind of a preface doesn't want to set the New Testament as a break against the Old Testament. No, it doesn't. He wants that both is being preserved. The new wine, the new wineskins, the old wine and the old wineskins, both together. Separate, but together. Only later, something else has been made out of that opposition. So that is a beginning. That sets the tone for his gospel, for the 10 Pauline letters that follow. And now you can understand how and why the canonical New Testament is, with a different opening, a counter text and a counter textual ensemble against this type of a New Testament as we have it from Marcion. Here we have 4 Gospels that start straight away, either with child stories in Luke and Matthew, which combine straight away Jesus' history with the Jewish tradition of the prophets and of the Torah. Then we have the temptation stories, which also link back. And then we have John the Baptist with these prophetic statements from Malachi and so forth. You can see how and which effort has been done to have a different opening of the later canonical New Testament collection. And also the same is true for the rest of the text. So this is the first way of rewriting, by reorganizing texts. The second way of rewriting, and I've taken the example of the Ignatian letters. Here we know Ignatius, who might have been, probably surely have been, has been a martyr in the 2nd century. He has written, however, many texts and letters we don't know. Jack Mose knows much more about that than I do. He will talk after me. But when we move into the 4th century, we have a collection already in the 4th century of 13 letters, all written in the name of Ignatius. Now, scholarship is unanimous. It's not just my opinion. It's not Jack's or Mark's. It's unanimous that originally there were not 13 letters. How many there were? It's a big dispute. But what we have is a manuscript from the 11th, 12th century, the Codex Hierosolomitanus, in which we have the oldest witness in manuscript form of the entire collection, which gives us 13 letters of Ignatius. In the same manuscript, the scribe also included another collection of Ignatius's letters, only 7 letters. Now, when you compare the 2 collections, you instantaneously see 6 more letters have been added, but also the old 7 letters have been thoroughly revised and rewritten, as if you had sprinkled the Old Testament and the New Testament across those 7 letters, because they were a bit poor of biblical quotes. No longer in the 13 letter collection. You will have more Old Testament, more New Testament quotations, almost every second sentence. You have more names, because the new letters come with new names, new people who are greeted. And you find the same people who are greeted in the new letters suddenly added to the 7 letters where these people have not appeared before. And from this kind of a rewriting, I approached the Pauline letters and asked myself, do we have a similar way of rewriting these letters as we have them in the Ignatian letters? And the most interesting part, of course, was in Ignatius, we discovered that it's not just done once this way. Ignatius's letters we found then in the 19th century also in the collections where only 3 letters existed. In other manuscripts, only 1 letter existed. And when we compare these earlier or let's say less numerous collections, we see that texts have either shrunk or been broadened in the later collection. Now, if we apply the same model as the 7 letters were broadened when the letters were also being added, or the 6 new letters have been added, if we apply that same model and ask whether we see the same elements comparing the 3 letters with the 7 letters, it occurred to me with the same model. So it's a way of how these letter collections grew. But because I'm not the specialist on the 3 letters, it's Jack. He better continues.
Well, I would like to maybe point people to the other videos we've done on that, because we've done a lot, and hopefully there'll be more videos on Ignatius coming. But for the sake of today, and as the title shows below, I'm hoping that we might answer some of the viewers' questions. And I know Mark has a little topic that he wants to talk about as well. So what we'll do, I think, is perhaps Mark, if we go with sort of your bit for a first, and then we'll come on to questions from our great Discord and Patreon members in just a moment. Mark.
Yeah, I don't know that we need to discuss my questions at length, but I did want to surface them as a way of starting, incentivizing, catalyzing broader conversations. I'm somebody who studied church history and theology and went to seminary, and I've been interested in things like ecumenism, right? Relationships between different Christian bodies and organizations. So, I was interested back in the day when the Catholic Church and the Lutheran Church made a joint declaration on justification by faith, and basically said, in effect, the Protestant Reformation was over because Catholics and Lutherans could now agree on the substance of justification by faith. I thought that was really, interesting back in the day. I participated in the an Oberlin gathering as well, which was part of the American ecumenical movement. But I've been thinking about that as it relates to the Marcionite tradition, right? Does Marcion divide Christian traditions? Does he bring them together? Does Marcion, in some ways, undercut every Christian tradition? Because many, if not, most of them are based on a foundational narrative that may not hold water scientifically. And so, what does it mean to come to terms with that? Are we in a Vatican I kind of moment or a Vatican II kind of moment? Vatican I did not look kindly on the kind of evolutionary thought that Darwin brought into the conversation. Vatican II, I think, tried to make peace with evolutionary models in some ways, but still going back in tradition. So I just want to bring that up. I know there are Marcionite churches, but I don't think that they have any kind of formal relationship. I think they're pretty small and insignificant in terms of how much of a population they represent. I did have correspondence with one of our readers, and he specifically mentioned, I won't mention names, but mentioned that he was Lutheran. And for him, Marcion scriptures are his key source now for thinking about what New Testament faith means. And he sees, he agrees with Marcionite priority. And, to my understanding is he's still a confessing Lutheran. So that's interesting to me, right? Can Marcion be reconciled with Lutheran faith? And I think, I'm also interested in broader questions about Christian-Jewish relations. And Markus, fortunately, has written an important article here on Marcion the Jew. And I continue, as I work on Marcion scriptures, to find very deep and profound connections between Marcion's scriptures and probably thus his piety and Jewish piety of the day. That to me reinforces that Marcion was not anti-Jewish, and he was not supersessionist, despite the popular narratives and even some of the scholarly articles. Dieter Roth has an article arguing that Marcion's reading of the Transfiguration is driven by supersessionism. To me, it's completely the other way around. I wrote my master's thesis in seminary on the doctrine of election, and what I saw in early Christian tradition is that the claims that Christians were replacing Israel, that they were the true Israel. Marcel Simon has a book called Verus Israel on this, but it was especially within what we would consider later Orthodoxy or early Orthodoxy, that very overt claims that we are the true Israel. were emerging, and some of our most vehement anti-Jewish, perhaps anti-Semitic rhetoric comes right out of proto-Orthodox circles like Melito of Sardis or John Chrysostom or what have you. So I just want to bring up broader sort of historical conversations. I know it's great to get into the data, to get into the weeds of these scriptures. I think that is crucial. But I also want to continually think about broader history, broader human populations. We have a population of 2 billion Christians on this planet. How are they going to start to wrestle with the implications if our research is at all scientifically valid, right? If there is any, even if it's 75% valid or 80% valid, it's a pretty significant twist in the conventional ways of understanding the emergence of Christian history. So I would love, for instance, to talk to scholars in the Lutheran tradition or ecumenical scholars about this. And I know also there's been just in the last 20 years, there have been debates, particularly in Germany and even in popular newspapers, about getting rid of the Old Testament and kind of reinvigorating Marcion as a way and putting it together with a dismissal of the Hebrew Bible. So there are all kinds of threads and sort of popular understandings of Marcion, which might be very different than what our team is doing and scholars like us are doing. So that's an open question, but I don't know that. I mean, we can discuss it, but I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about those things as much as just prepare the ground for those future conversations.
Well, I mean, it's one of those conversations that I get asked all the time, particularly as someone who goes to the Latin Mass. There aren't many people who go to a Latin Mass who also like Marcion. Funnily enough, the crossover is pretty slim, particularly then who like Marcion and then maybe also think that his version of a text comes earlier. That might be a sum total of 1.2 billion Catholics. But on saying that, I mean, it's a question I think about also. And I think that there's a twofold element to this. And the first is that there is a Protestant and a Catholic divide on what can happen here. So in the Protestant churches, it depends where you go, what you do, what you believe, and every Protestant church will manifest probably a different outworking of this. But unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your point of view, the Catholic Church has rather bound herself up quite neatly to the current canon. And it's interesting that it's only in a post-Reformation world in 1547 that the church actually does that. Although she talks previously, in Rome and Laodicea, and also with Athanasius before that, about the canon and what it should be, only in 1442 at Florence, but then finally in 1547 at Trent, do we decide, I say we, the Catholic Church, decide this is it. And I think that if you had raised your argument, not that you would have got any traction, you've probably been burned, but if you'd have raised this argument in 1541, in the year before the Council of Florence, at least you might have had some ability to change the outcome based on evidence. Again, like I say, you'd have been burned, but the possibility was there. In a post-Trent world, I don't think this is ever going to touch anything in the Catholic Church, and I don't think that even if you proved, you found a version of Paul to the Romans in a Marcionite form signed off by the apostle himself, I don't think that would make the slightest bit of difference. And that's partly because of the process of canon, for those who don't know in the Catholic Church, is that it's the church that decides canon, not the canon that decides the church. And so the books that she's recognised are authoritative according to her because she says so. And that's always been, in some sense, the way the church has gone. I think also of Eusebius when he talks about letters and texts that are recognized as canon, and some that are disputed, some that are spurious, but yet despite being disputed, everyone seems to be allowed them. Now there are some we definitely can't have, and they sit over here in a big dirty box of scum. But then the others, well, yeah, I mean, okay, if you want Barnabas or you want the Didache, you can probably have it, but it is spurious, so be careful with it. And so the authorship of a text, although it has played a part in the decision about what should go in, has not always been the definitive element. And so, yeah, I think it's probably not the way you want it to go, Mark, and not your hope for Marcionite study, maybe. But even under the most sort of liberal of popes, like Francis or perhaps maybe Leo, we'll give him time and see what works out. I don't see a place for Marcion to even be discussed, never mind considered authoritative. What I would say to add to that, and I think this is important, and this is what the attempts I make in my circles are, and I make this with Origin too, I should say, is I try and grandfather Marcion in by making it extremely clear, I think, that he may well be a material heretic according to the church's definitions, but he certainly is not a formal one, I don't think. And so I think it's pretty rough to judge him by whatever the standard of the church is now, in the same way that you would never complain to St. Thomas Aquinas that he doesn't believe in the Immaculate Conception or the Assumption. He seems to get a buy on those two infallible doctrines, but yet they're now infallible. I'm not saying Marcion is quite of that same caliber as Aquinas, depending on your love for scholasticism, but he should be recognized as what he was, a early Christian church leader, making his way in the world, putting up the discussion and the arguments of the day. And to just dismiss him as the arch heretic, as Judith Liu did, I think does quite an injustice both to his legacy and probably to his impact at the time. Because ultimately, if Justin Martyr is willing to at least give him some time of day, and I don't think Justin strikes me as a particularly patient man, I think the Catholic Church should at least give him that same recognition in that way.
I'm also thinking about how it was Origen, I think, was a big part of the impetus behind Vatican II. It's de Lubac and Danielou, and it's basically taking somebody who had been villainized but did not deserve it at all. Was in an early third century context, Origen is quite fitting for his day, and to judge him according to the standards of fourth century theological disputes does an injustice to Origen. So Vatican II seemed to me it was its own moment, it was its own thing, but some of it was coming to terms with this deeper history and how the villainization of some of the most important scholars and minds of early Christianity needed to be redressed in some way. And that this is why I bring up Marcion. If he has been incorrectly villainized and he's not a crazy uncle, but actually a father figure, some ways to Christianity, if we receive our scriptures through him, even if they are rewritten scriptures in the form that most people know, then he does not deserve to be villainized. He deserves to be made into a saint. And maybe that's a provisional step. Maybe it's not to endorse doctrine, but to recognize a debt that is owed.
But isn't that exactly the problem that we are discussing and in the background? It's to what extent do we have to or need to or shouldn't link theological statements with historical statements? As soon as you make history the decisive factor for theology, I think then you depend on historians. And then it's inconsistent to say, well, historians discover fragment A or fragment B, which wasn't there, which shouldn't be there, so we better bury it. Yeah, we don't want to hear from it. Or the historians come up with a reconstruction which for historians makes sense or make growing sense. Yeah. But then because of theological statements, we ignore that. My takeaway from the work we do is and Jack is a fantastic example. Yeah, you can have a historical mind, and you can have a Catholic heart, and why should the one not work with the other? So you can have statements of belief, of trust, of all kinds of things, yeah, which make sense to you for your life, and to me, I could not be a Marcionite. Yeah, I can see that in Marcion's texts, I see some advantages over and against, let's say, the Catholic texts or the Catholic New Testament. Or I give you an example. I prefer equality, which apparently was very important to Marcion, between women and men, with regards to religious and also social standings, which is somehow acknowledged today, disputed in many fundamentalists' circles. But clearly, all these fundamentalists are well based on the canonical texts. I mean, read the canonical New Testament and you will have the same, let's say, the same senses that Marcion must have had when he read the Jewish Bible. That it's completely incongruent with any belief and any statement of equality between gender. Impossible. Second comparison, Marcion apparently was either not aware or at least not endorsing slavery. Now, if you go into the canonical New Testament, every slaveholder and every society that deploys slavery as part of their makeup has the full backing of the canonical New Testament. No church can dispute that. It's just written into the agenda. To make that New Testament, the canonical New Testament, God's word, then God has endorsed slaveholding as part of the liturgy, as part of, as he says, it's service to God. I can only endorse Marcion's text in this regard. I think what our work tries to show is, all of these writings, all of these collections, all of the outcomes are human-made. Now, how does that reflect and can be reflected with a statement of sola scriptura on the one side, or on the other side with the Holy Spirit being behind the outcome or even the origin of these texts? Well, that's a crucial question. And I think we have to distinguish a historical process from these questions and answers to these questions. That's what we need to do. If you combine the one, I have to say, then you're dependent on me as a historian. Don't make that happen. Don't build religion on historians. Build religion on what they are, namely interpretations of what also historians and other sociologists, anthropologists, ethnographers, politicians provide you with. But don't make yourself as a religion dependent on Trump, on Biden, on whoever, and certainly not on historians. I'm not a maker of religion. I can advise on how these texts and this type of religion, like early Christianity, in the prospectus and conspectus with Jews and with other religious developments, Greco-Roman developments, how that potentially has come together. But then you need to take that into consideration, and you may say, oh, well, indeed, we should have another reform of the canon. I know colleagues have done that, and honestly, that's really what happens. If you look into the liturgy of the Vatican II, for example, and how they have remodeled the reading of the Jewish Bible, they cut out so many texts, verses from the Psalms, which are offending and offensive. They have you will not come across a number of passages of the Jewish Bible, precisely those which were offensive for somebody like Marcion. So I think the churches today are in many, many ways more Marcionite than the churches for 1,500 years. The response in the 2nd century to Marcion was very different. There were supersessionists. They were replacing Jews. And if it had come along their way, not a single Jew would be alive today. They would all be either Christians or wouldn't exist. And unfortunately, that was the policy which has been taken, particularly in my own country, in Germany. So we have to be critical, as I said in the beginning, to ourselves, to our own traditions, and also distinguish between historical statements and religious belief statements.
Well, Marcus, I mean, don't do yourself down. I mean, if you started a cult, I'd probably join it. So maybe you could be a creator of theology. And I have been called do you know what? More recently, I've been called a Vincentian than a Christian. So maybe that says something about our relationship and work we do.
Could I could I add a bit here too? I
Yeah,
think
go on.
it's been brought up actually many times, Marcus, in our verse by verse discussions that the lectionary readings favor the Marcionite texts. Actually, these big chunks about fundraising and Paul's self-aggrandizement. I don't think the analysis has been done yet to look at the Catholic lectionary, Revised Common Lectionary, and kind of map it onto Marcionite text. But my guess is that there's a very strong tendency to favor the Marcionite verses as kind of the core of the Christian traditions. And I'm just thinking more broadly here too about phenomena like priestly celibacy, phenomena like monasticism. The Pope may not self-identify as a Marcionite, but by practicing chastity, the Pope is effectively a Marcionite.
I
And the
agree.
Catholic Church, right, in that respect, in the sense of sexual abstinence, all Christian monastic movements, which we tend to credit, people like Saint Anthony the Great or Benedict, or somebody like Francis, we tend to credit these people as pioneers, Shenouda, Pachomius, but
Mhm.
Marcion was way ahead of them in terms of pioneering this practice, and maybe not making it normative in the same way, or not having a fully developed like bifurcation of sort of the normies and the monks, the ascetics. But asceticism never went away in Christianity. It just resurfaced in these monastic communities that in many ways kept antiquity alive for us today. So every monk is a Marcionite to some extent,
I agree.
and whether we like it or not, that's in terms of practice and habits. Liturgy, same thing, right? There are liturgical, as Alistair Stewart Sykes has noted, there are elements of the liturgy that probably go back to the Marcionite side of the tradition, and that may still be practiced today. So I just feel like we need to normalize Marcion as being part of a broader, and not villainize, not take a hero versus villain, orthodox versus heretic model for every discussion about everything, whether it's liturgy or all these different things, and so kind of just come to terms, even if it's not reforming, at least just coming to terms with the complexity of our history. I think is really important.
I,
And I think that's so funny because in many ways I think Marcion gets a harsher rap than some of the later actual heretics who formally rebelled against the church. I mean, okay, the Catholic Church has its qualms with Luther, but I don't hear people being as aggressive if I say something generous towards Luther. Let's say, well, maybe Luther was good on faith alone, to which we now agree with him, as you mentioned earlier with that agreement. But then you say, well, Marcion was good on X. And people are like, no, arch heretic, the most horrendous person ever. And you're like, well, I don't know. I think, if anything, from a Catholic perspective, Luther was probably worse. So what you have to reconcile that. And I'd also say on the lectionary side of it as well, is that I think I have picked up on that. The more close readings we do, the more I have picked up on thinking, gosh, I know this one. And I don't read the canonical text half as much as I now read the Marcionite text. So if I know it, it's probably from my other memory. And I mostly go to the old mass rather than the new one. So it'd be interesting to see how the lectionary is picked up on different places in those things. And then lastly, before Marcus maybe wraps us up, we haven't got to anyone else's questions, but we'll cut another time. Um, Again, I completely agree with you that it's about the bringing back into the memory of someone who has been massively denigrated, rather than, from my perspective, the canonization of him. And I think also particularly of when people die or the further they are in the past, we feel more at liberty to say dreadful things about them. And I just think that's a really unhelpful thing. And okay, with the advent of social media, at least via the keyboard, people are willing to say pretty horrendous things too. But I just don't know how helpful that is, particularly about someone who clearly isn't a violent, murdering head case. Like I said earlier, to me, I just see him the same as Justin Martyr. It's just that Justin's tradition eventually wins, and I'm grateful for that as a Catholic. But that's what happened, right? It was that two people had an opposing view and one side wins.
And the interesting thing is that people like Tertullian, for example, right? They were regarded indeed in the 4th, 5th century as being deviators, if not a heretic, because he really had a stance against the Catholic Church in Rome, endorsing the prophetism of Philomena and of the Phrygians. Yeah, so he declared himself no longer to be a subscriber of that Catholic Church in Rome, particularly in this work against Marcion. So here, if you like, here's one heretic making a heretic of the other, of the opponent. But that's not being picked up later, yeah, because in Irenaeus it's clear, because he was regarded as orthodox. So when he talks about the heretics, then the heretics are heretics, yeah. But I did have a discussion with David Littwer a few days ago on this question of hereticism, and I pointed out again, and in Marcion's lifetime there were disputes. There were demonization, and to give credit to all his criticizers, Marcion was the first who read in his Pauline text. So either it was by Paul, who was the beginner, I don't know, but he reads that these false brothers, they are like demons, yeah, they are like the Satan himself. So this kind of demonization of the opponent seems to be an old story in humanities. It's, as you, Jack, says, it's not a helpful one, whether it's being said by Marcion, by Paul, whoever says it later. What I also tried to say in this Christoph Kornweit discussion, because he pressed me, he wanted to hear something of me about Marcion, of course, yeah. I resisted that in the beginning, if you listen to that interview, because I then said, our focus is not on Marcion. Yes, we have to deal with Marcion's text because it's the first text that we have get hold of, at least in the reconstruction. But particularly that work over the last years have shown that he himself is embedded, very, very closely embedded with and in the discussion of these texts, of these memories, of these oral and written traditions, where people we today call Orthodox, yeah, were closely working with him, and he was working with these people. That people do not get on at the end and do have different opinions. That's what humanities are, and probably that's what we have learned and earned through evolution from other species as well. We should know better, which apparently we don't. But that's also human fate in a way. But it is clear to me, when we talk about Marcion, it is not because we have a hero. No, because we have one piece which had been set aside for so many years. And only there, that's the reason why we put that piece in. And it seems that we are obsessed with this piece. No, we aren't. We are obsessed with the picture. And the bigger picture we get in a better way if we have more pieces together. But these pieces are interrelated. And I know, particularly those people who want him to be heretic, want to set the stone aside again because they want to see their old picture. It's not because they hate Marcion. No, they love their own picture, which they have in mind, which they have been implanted by people like Irenaeus, and from which they don't want to move away. But that's for ideological reasons, not for historical ones.
Yeah,
I would
100%.
agree with that. Oh, I was just going to say that Marcion is an earthen vessel, right? He's a ostrakinos sarkos, right? He's not. Our research is not about him as such. It's about him as a conduit of data. To put it quite,
Right.
simply. Markus was talking in the interview with CJ about how we have to go backwards in history, retrospect, but also slice history. I think that's a helpful metaphor to think about it. the layers or stratigraphy. We need to uncover strata. So what I think what our method is not Marcion as a person really at all. It's about what data does Marcion give us, and if Marcion is our earliest significant repository, if Marcion is our earliest significant, or gives us our earliest significant stratum of data that has statistically significant relationship, and this is where the data science stuff comes in, and this in some ways is responsive to the questions that have been asked. We can put up all kinds of models about whether Mark came first or second, whether Matthew came first or second, whether it's late first century or mid second century or early second. Every scholar can have their pet theories, but until we actually build data profiles that represent strata that have statistically significant differences with other strata, we're all just flying in the dark, right? We're just blind people leading the blind. We need to focus on specific, if we want to do science in earliest Christian history and with earliest Christian texts, we need to delineate profiles, we need to delineate strata, and we need to split strata. So that, to me, that's what our enterprise has been about in many ways. It's profile building in a robust, very meticulous way, computerized way, but it's also about strata splitting. When you split the Ignatians between the 3 and the 7, or the 7 and 3, that splitting is giving us insight into history, into an actual change that's meaningful, demonstrable, quantifiable, all those kinds of things. And to me, 99% of New Testament scholarship is built on sand, because they never point out statistically significant differences in the data. They don't, right? Like the L source or the M source, nobody's ever shown that the L source has statistical significance. There's no statistically significant differences in the L source, and the M source, same thing. But when I look at the data and I read, the opening of Luke, for instance, statistically, phenomenologically, it looks a lot like the parable of the prodigal son. It looks a lot like the Ascension. It looks a lot like all the other places where we know Marcion's gospel had no content. This is about data compiling, data refining, data profile building, and giving the tools to the next generation of scholars. Maybe it'll be us, maybe it'll be other people, but giving us the tools to actually map the evolutionary history of early Christian texts. And in some ways, we can't map everything. That's never going to happen, right? But there's a lot that we can map way more precisely than we've mapped thus far. But we got to start doing this splitting, as Jack has done and as Markus has done.
Yeah, and we are not yet there. I mean, yes, we have done the reconstruction now of Paul. We have different reconstructions of Marcion's gospel. We have no reconstruction of the antitheses of the preface yet. And particularly also to answer one of the other questions, we cannot say at the moment whether this Marcionite gospel is the mother of all gospels. We have, Matthias Klinghardt and Dietrich Roth as well, they have done a meticulous work on comparing this gospel with the synoptic gospels. Yeah, Matthias even with John. But I have done a comparison because I worked together with Tobias Niklas on the translation commentary on the Gospel of Peter, which is being published in the apocryphal collection of Schroeder and Marcion. And so, just to give that as an example, I noticed whenever, because that is like a harmony, the Gospel of Peter, it reads like a harmony of the 4 Gospels. But if you compare it, if you lay aside and compare it with Marcion's gospel, you will discover what I discovered. And this is open business. You can do it yourself. You will see that whenever the 3 or the 4 gospels, the canonical gospels, come together and have very similar wording, you have a verse in Marcion's gospel. If you see that in Marcion's gospel verses are absent, sometimes in a follow-up, I've shown that. So you have verse 1, verse 3, verse 5, present in Marcion's gospel. Those 3 verses, you will find that the 3 or the 4 will be in harmony. In number 2 and number 4, they will go wherever they want. It shows This is the mother source, at least for the Gospel of Peter. Whether that's true for other Gospels, we miss the data yet. So we need to do that data comparison, and I hope in the near future we will have that. Jack and Mark, they're also working with Lance on providing the data for all second century Christian and non-Christian material, because I think Jan Bremer is right. We haven't even done, I mean, we are all sitting in our small classes and we're not looking out for non-Christian texts. No, we have to. We have to look into non-Christian texts, into Jewish texts, into pagan texts, and then we have to make the comparisons. We noticed already with the few data that we have that a lot of the canonical strand interlinks with Lucian of Samosata, for example. So late 2nd century data. But that needs to be pursued. I mean, we're too early to answer that question. So for the moment, let's say we are like David. I don't want to claim and to criticize him here, David Blitwer. We are all on our way, yeah, and are learning to read data and to interpret them, and that we not always have the same interpretation. That's quite clear, even not the three of us here. But we're working with each other and trying the best we can.
Yeah, 100%. Well, I'm very sorry that we didn't get to the questions of viewers, but that is how we roll at Patristica. Sometimes it just happens and time gets away from us. But we will keep all of your questions, and I promise we'll record on them soon. And if you have any others, post them down in the description and we'll get there. As always, Marcus, thanks so much for joining me. And until next time, have a good one. Bye-bye.